I remember how, as a child, emotions were something uncomfortable. They scared adults. They weren't accepted, hugged, or listened to. They were silenced. And I learned to silence myself. I was 6 when I first cried at people. It was the day my favorite dog disappeared. I looked for him all over the yard, clicking, running, and then I just sat on the stairs and cried. The tears were sincere, like rain that doesn't ask for permission. But instead of hugs I feel, "Don't roar. He's just a dog. You're already big." Big. This word has become a trap. Big means to be silent. Big means not to show weakness. Big means to be comfortable. I learned to hide my tears. First in my pillow. Then in myself. I learned to smile when everything inside was screaming. I learned to say, "It's okay," when I just wanted to be heard. At school, emotions were even more undesirable. The boys in the class made fun of those who showed them. They called it snot, weakness, girlishness. I saw one boy, Sasha, burst into tears after being humiliated by his teacher. And how after that they started avoiding him. I understood, to cry meant to become an outcast. Then I started to build a wall. High, strong, silent. I became someone who could not be touched. Someone who did not show. Someone who did not say, "It hurts me." And the more I kept quiet, the more they praised me. "Well done, don't whine. A real man." I wish everyone was like that. But something inside was cracking. Like ice that seems solid but spring is already flowing under it. In my teens I started writing. It was the only way to speak without breaking the rules. I wrote poems that no one read. They were about pain, about fear, about the tenderness that I hid. I wrote about myself, but in the third person. 'Cause it was safer that way. One day my mother found my notebook. She read it and said, "What is this about you? Are you so weak?" I didn't answer. I just took the notebook and burned it. Then I decided, never again. Never show it. Never write. Never be like that. But emotions are like water. They cannot be stopped forever. They know cracks. And one day, when I was already an adult, they burst through. That was the moment when I met Yulia. She wasn't afraid of emotions. She spoke of them as friends. She cried when she was in pain and laughed when she was happy. She didn't apologize for herself. And that was new. I remember one evening she said, "You are always so reserved. You won't let yourself be alive." Those words were like ice that cracked. I didn't answer. But that night I started writing again. And for the first time about myself. In the first person. Without masks. It was the beginning. The beginning of the journey to myself. To not apologizing. To being. My first anger was pure. Like a flame that doesn't want to burn. It just wants to shine. I was still a child when one of my relatives humiliated my mother in front of me. I didn't understand all the words, but I saw her eyes. The ones that drooped like broken wings. And something inside me clenched. I clenched my fists, wanted to scream, protect, say, "Don't you dare." But they told me, "Don't interfere. This is adult business." I didn't interfere. And the anger remained in me. Like an unfinished movement. Like a word that wasn't said. Later, when I was insulted at school, I also kept quiet. I was afraid that if I answered, I would become aggressive. And aggressive people are not liked. They are punished. They are feared. They are isolated. I saw one boy, Ilya, being kicked out of the circle because he spoke out loudly against injustice. He didn't fight. He just shouted. But that was enough to be called problematic. I decided, it's better to be quiet. It's better to swallow. It's better not to defend myself. And I swallowed. When I was humiliated. When I was compared. When I was forced to be someone I wasn't. I swallowed anger like stones. And it accumulated. At 20, I could no longer distinguish between pain and anger. Everything merged into one, into silent fatigue. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I just disappeared. I walked away. From people, from situations, from myself. But anger is not an enemy. It's a signal. It's protection. It's a boundary that says, I can't be crossed. I understood this only when Yulia said, "You never get angry. It's not normal. You have the right to be angry." I didn't know what to say. Because I didn't know how to get angry. I only knew how to suppress. Once we were at a party and someone made a rude joke about me. Smiled. As usual. But Yulia looked at me and said, "Why are you smiling? That was offensive." I replied, "Nothing. I'm used to it." She was silent. And then she said, "Don't get used to it. You have the right to defend yourself." Those words were like a crack in the wall. I started remembering all the moments when I wanted to say no, but I said, "Okay." When I wanted to leave, but I stayed. When I wanted to scream, but I was silent. And then for the first time I allowed myself to write about anger. Not as something terrible, but as something living. I wrote about how anger is love for myself. How it says, "I can't be broken." How it doesn't destroy but protects. I started practicing small no. Small, "It doesn't suit me." Little, "It hurts me when you say that." And each one was like a return to myself. Anger was no longer an enemy. Had become my ally. Quiet, strong, honest. I was no longer afraid of it. Because I was no longer afraid of myself. Don't cry. It's weakness. But why does my heart clench when I see someone crying? Why are other people's tears like a mirror in which I see myself? The one I've been hiding all my life. I learned not to cry early. Very early. Before I even understood what shame was. Tears were something that irritated adults. They didn't ask, "What's wrong?" They said, "Stop." And I stopped. Not because the pain was gone. But because I didn't want to be a burden. 7. I fell off my bike. My knee was torn, blood was flowing, but I didn't cry. I remember gritting my teeth. Looking at my mother who said, "Good job. A real boy." It was approval. And I remembered, not crying means being good. But tears don't go away. They just change shape. They become a headache. Insomnia. Shaking hands. Inexplicable fatigue. They become a silence that screams. As a teenager I cried only at night. Quietly. Under the covers. And always with a sense of guilt. As if I was doing something forbidden. As if my tears were a betrayal. I saw other boys hiding their tears too. We were all actors. We played the role of strong. But in their eyes there was fatigue. And fear. And loneliness. Once I saw my friend, Artem, crying after a fight with his father. I wanted to hug him. To say, "I understand." But he pushed me away. He said, "Don't look. I don't want you to see me like this." Like this. As if crying is something shameful. As if he has ceased to be human. I also didn't want to be seen like this. That's why I became a master of disguise. Smile is when it hurts. A joke is when you want to scream. Detachment is when your heart is breaking. But then Yulia appeared. She cried. Freely. Without shame. She could burst into tears in the middle of a conversation when something touched her deeply. And she didn't apologize. She just was. I remember how she once said, "Tears are not weakness. It's the truth. And I want to be truthful." These words were like a light in a dark corridor. I began to think, what if tears are not the end, but the beginning? What if they are not a sign of defeat, but a sign of presence? One evening we talked about childhood. And I told her about that incident with the bicycle. About how I didn't cry. And she said, "I wish you had cried then. That would be honest." I didn't answer. But that night I cried. For the first time without hiding. For the first time without apologizing. And she was just there. Without words. Without judgment. Just there. That was the moment I realized. Tears are not weakness. They are connection. They are trust. They are life. I began to allow myself to cry. Not always. Not in front of everyone. But without shame. Without internal judgment. And every tear was like a return. To myself. To my body. To a heart that no longer wanted to be a stone. I don't remember the exact moment when Yulia became more than just a close person to me. It wasn't sudden. It was like dawn, gradually, gently, but inevitably. She didn't break down my walls. She just sat there until I wanted to take them down myself. We often talked about things that others considered unimportant, about how hard it is to be honest, about how painful it is when you're not heard, about how scary it is to show your true self. I once told her how, as a child, I was forced to apologize for being in a bad mood. How they told me, "Mel, people don't like seeing you like that." And I smiled, even when I wanted to disappear. Yulia listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't analyze. She was just there. And then she said, "It's not your responsibility to be comfortable. You have the right to all your emotions, even the ones that scared others." Kept quiet, because these words were new, like a language I had always understood but never heard. She continued, "I want you to know, I don't need you to be okay. I need you to be real." It was like letting myself breathe deeply, without fear of someone saying, "You're too much." We were sitting in the kitchen. It was late. Tea was getting cold. And for the first time I said, "I often hurt, but I don't know how to talk about it." She smiled. And she said, "Start by not apologizing." Those words became a mantra. I began to notice how often I said, "I'm sorry for being like this. I'm sorry for being sad. I'm sorry for not being happy." And every time I said them, she would gently stop me. "Don't apologize. Just be." I started writing about it. About how we apologize for tears, for anger, for tiredness, for silence. How we apologize for being alive. And how it kills us slowly. Julia became my space without apologies. Place where I could be imperfect, could be silent, could speak, could cry, could laugh. And all of it was accepted. One day I said to her, "You taught me to be myself." And she replied, "No. You just remembered who you were before you were taught to hide." Those words became a starting point. I no longer wanted to be comfortable. I wanted to be real. Even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it's scary. Even if not everyone likes it. Because I learned, emotions are not a flaw. They are the language of the soul. And I no longer want to be silent. I don't remember the exact moment when Yulia became more than just a close person to me. It wasn't sudden. It was like dawn, gradually, gently, but inevitably. She didn't break down my walls. She just sat there until I wanted to take them down myself. We often talked about things that others considered unimportant, about how hard it is to be honest, about how painful it is when you're not heard, about how scary it is to show your true self. I once told her how, as a child, I was forced to apologize for being in a bad mood. How they told me, "Mel, people don't like seeing you like that." And I smiled, even when I wanted to disappear. Yulia listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't analyze. She was just there. And then she said, "It's not your responsibility to be comfortable. You have the right to all your emotions, even the ones that scared others." Kept quiet, because these words were new, like a language I had always understood but never heard. She continued, "I want you to know, I don't need you to be okay. I need you to be real." It was like letting myself breathe deeply, without fear of someone saying, "You're too much." We were sitting in the kitchen. It was late. Tea was getting cold. And for the first time I said, "I often hurt, but I don't know how to talk about it." She smiled. And she said, "Start by not apologizing." Those words became a mantra. I began to notice how often I said, "I'm sorry for being like this. I'm sorry for being sad. I'm sorry for not being happy." And every time I said them, she would gently stop me. "Don't apologize. Just be." I started writing about it. About how we apologize for tears, for anger, for tiredness, for silence. How we apologize for being alive. And how it kills us slowly. Julia became my space without apologies. Place where I could be imperfect, could be silent, could speak, could cry, could laugh. And all of it was accepted. One day I said to her, "You taught me to be myself." And she replied, "No. You just remembered who you were before you were taught to hide." Those words became a starting point. I no longer wanted to be comfortable. I wanted to be real. Even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it's scary. Even if not everyone likes it. Because I learned, emotions are not a flaw. They are the language of the soul. And I no longer want to be silent. For a long time I lived in the everything is fine mode. It was my armor, my mask, my protection. I said it automatically. Even when I had no strength, even when my heart was clenching, even when I wanted to just disappear. Everything is fine is like a shadow that hides the real thing. And I was the master of this shadow. But one day I couldn't anymore. It was an ordinary evening. Yulia and I were sitting on the balcony, drinking tea. She was telling me something and I was silent. Not because I wasn't listening, but because something inside was breaking. She looked at me and asked, "Are you here?" You're silent somehow differently. I wanted to say, everything is fine. But I couldn't. And then I just whispered, "I'm hurt." She didn't get scared. She didn't start asking why. She didn't try to fix it. She just said, "I'm with you." It was the first time I said those words out loud. And they didn't make me weak. They made me honest. I started remembering all the times I was hurt but kept quiet. When I was betrayed. When I was compared. When I was forced to be something I wasn't. When I wasn't heard. When I was abandoned. And I realized, pain is not the enemy. It's a part of me. It's a signal. It's a memory. It's an experience. I started writing about it. About how we hide pain because we're afraid of being too much. About how we learn to be silent because we're not taught to speak. About how we become strangers to ourselves because we don't allow ourselves to be authentic. I wrote a text I called "I Hurt." And it became the most honest of all. There were no metaphors. There were no embellishments. Just the truth. Published it. And I was afraid. Afraid of the reaction. Afraid of judgment. I was afraid that they would say, "You're dramatic." But something else happened. People wrote. "Feel the same way. Thank you for saying that." It helped me not to be ashamed of my pain. And I realized, the truth is not a burden. It's a bridge. Between me and the world. Between me and myself. I started saying it hurts more often. Not to everyone. Not always. But to those who are able to hear. And every time it was like healing. Because when you admit your pain, you stop being its hostage. Julia said, "You learn to be alive. And this is the bravest thing you could do." Smiled. And answered, "I just stopped hiding myself. I live differently. Not because the world has changed. But because I no longer change myself for the world. My heart no longer asks for permission. It doesn't ask, 'Can I be sad today?' Or 'Am I too open?' Simply speaks. And I listen. I no longer apologize for the fact that it's hard for me. For the fact that I'm silent. For the fact that I cry. For the fact that I'm not always strong. For the fact that I'm alive. I learn to be with myself. Not to run away. Not to hide. Not to punish myself for emotions. I learn to hug myself when no one hugs me. I learn to say, I am. Even when the world says, be different. My heart is not an apology. It is a space. For pain. For joy. For anger. For tenderness. For everything that makes me me. I no longer play a role. I no longer try to be right. Simply am. And that is my freedom. Yulia once said, "You have become my home." Thought yes. I no longer seek refuge in other people's eyes. Because I have found it in myself. I write texts that not everyone likes. I say things that are not always comfortable. I cry when my heart asks. I am silent when my soul is tired. I laugh when the world seems easy. And all this without apologies. Because my heart is not an apology. It is the truth. I am no longer afraid of being too much. Because I know, those who love truly are not afraid of depth. They don't say, be simpler. They say, be yourself. And I am. I am the one who cried as a child, but learned not to be ashamed of the tears. I am the one who feared anger, but learned to defend myself. I am the one who was silent but learned to speak. I am the one who apologized but learned to live without apologies. I am the heart that no longer hides.